Look at your phone right now. Turn it over in your hand. There is a real chance it was assembled in a country that, 50 years ago, was one of the poorest places on the entire planet. Now look down at your shoes, your shirt, the headphones you might be wearing. More and more of them carry the same three quiet words. Made in Vietnam. Half a century ago, this country was bombed, broken, and literally starving. Its people stood in lines for a handful of rice. Today, it is one of the fastest-growing economies on Earth, a factory floor for the biggest brands humanity has ever built. So how does a nation travel from ruins to boom inside a single human lifetime? This is not a story of luck. It is a story of one terrifying decision, a piece of almost perfect geography, and a brutal fight between two superpowers that Vietnam turned to its own advantage. Let's break the whole thing down, from the ashes to the boom. First, just how big is this boom, really? Let's start with the money in people's pockets. In 1990, the average person in Vietnam earned just a couple of $100s for an entire year. That is less than $1 a day. Today, that figure has multiplied many times over, and it keeps climbing fast. For most of the last 3 decades, Vietnam's economy has grown around 6 to 7% every single year. That might not sound dramatic, but compounding growth is a quiet miracle. It means the whole economy roughly doubles about every decade. Compare that to the United States or Western Europe, growing at maybe 2%. Vietnam has been sprinting while the rich world walks. And the human results are staggering. In the early 1990s, well over half the population lived in extreme poverty. Today, that number has collapsed to just a few percent. Tens of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in a single generation. A country that once begged the world for food now helps feed it. It is one of the great turnarounds in modern history. But to truly understand the rise, you first have to see the fall. So let's rewind, all the way back to 1975. Vietnam had just survived one of the most devastating wars of the 20th century. For decades, the country had been a battlefield. Millions of people had died. Cities were flattened. Farmland was poisoned and cratered. The nation was exhausted and shattered. The country, long divided, was now forced back together under one new government. And that government arrived with a bold and total plan. They would run the entire economy the strict communist way. The state would own all the farms. The state would own all the factories. The state would decide every single price and every single wage. There would be no private business, no profit, no competition. On paper, it promised fairness for everyone. In reality, it was an economic catastrophe waiting to happen. Here is the fatal flaw in controlling absolutely everything. Imagine you are a farmer. You work extra hard and grow a huge surplus of rice. But the state simply takes all of it and hands you the same tiny ration as everyone else. So why on earth would you work harder next year? The honest answer is, you wouldn't. And across the whole country, that is exactly what happened. Effort vanished. Everyone did the absolute minimum to get by. Factories produced shoddy goods that no one really wanted. Store shelves went bare. And then came the printing presses. To cover its debts, the government printed money, and inflation exploded. Prices doubled, then doubled again, until savings became worthless. By the mid-1980s, a country full of rich farmland was gripped by famine. People were genuinely going hungry in one of the best rice-growing regions on Earth. Desperate families crowded onto boats and fled across the sea. The situation was so dire that even the government could no longer deny it. The leaders of Vietnam faced a truly brutal choice. They could cling to the pure communist system that was starving their own people, or they could do something almost unthinkable for a communist state. They could let capitalism back in. And in 1986, after years of failure, they made their move. They launched a sweeping set of reforms called Doi Moi. The word roughly means the renovation. And renovate is exactly what it did. Doi Moi did something radical for a communist country. It let people make money again. Farmers could now keep and sell their surplus crops for real profit. Ordinary families were suddenly allowed to open their own small businesses. Little shops, food stalls, and workshops popped up everywhere. The heavy hand of the state slowly began to pull back. And critically, prices were allowed to be set by supply and demand, not by bureaucrats. The effect was almost immediate and almost magical. Remember that starving nation gripped by famine? Within just a few short years, Vietnam became one of the largest rice exporters in the entire world. The same soil, the same rivers, The same farmers. Nothing physical had changed at all. The only thing that changed was the reason to get up and work. Give a person a reason to try, and they will move mountains. But feeding itself was only the first step. Because Doi Moi did one more thing that would change everything. It threw open Vietnam's doors to the entire outside world. For the first time in a generation, foreign companies were invited in. Invited to build their factories on Vietnamese soil, using Vietnamese workers. And this, finally, is where geography walks onto the stage. Because Vietnam is not just any old location. It is a spectacular one. Let me show you why. First, look at who its neighbor is. Vietnam sits right on the border of China. China, for decades, has been the manufacturing workshop of the entire world. Being the next-door neighbor to the planet's biggest factory is an enormous advantage. Components and raw materials can cross that border in hours. A factory in Vietnam can plug straight into China's giant supply chain. Now look at the strange, beautiful shape of the country itself. Vietnam is long and thin, curving down the coast like the letter S. And that gives it a coastline stretching over 3,000 kilometers. 3,000 kilometers of access to the sea. That coast is dotted with natural deepwater ports. Ports deep enough for the largest cargo ships on the ocean to dock and load. And from those ports, goods can sail to America, to Europe, to all of Asia. Vietnam has both a land bridge to China and a sea gateway to the world. Geography handed this country a nearly perfect business address. But an address means nothing without the right people to fill it. And that is Vietnam's second, and maybe greatest, secret weapon. Vietnam has a young population. Strikingly young. For decades, the vast majority of its people were of prime working age. Economists have a name for this. They call it a demographic dividend. A giant wave of young, healthy, motivated people, all ready to work. And crucially, they were willing to work for far lower wages than richer countries. Vietnam also invested heavily in basic education and literacy. So these were not just cheap workers. They were cheap and capable workers. For a global company hunting for a place to make things, this was pure gold. Young, cheap, literate, hardworking, stable, and right beside China. Now, hold one crucial question in your mind as we continue. What happens to all of China's factories the day China itself becomes too expensive? Because that day arrived, and it changed the world. For decades, China was simply where the world made everything. It was astonishingly cheap, incredibly fast, and impossibly huge. Whole industries packed up and moved there. It seemed unstoppable. But success carries a hidden cost. As China grew wealthy, its workers, quite rightly, began to demand higher pay. Wages rose. Living standards rose. And China got richer. But that also meant making things in China slowly became more and more expensive. The country was, in a sense, becoming a victim of its own success. And then came a second, sudden shock. A trade war erupted between China and the United States. America began slapping heavy tariffs, basically extra taxes, on Chinese goods. Overnight, products made in China became pricier and politically risky. Suddenly, putting all your factories in one single country looked dangerous. The bosses of the world's biggest companies started to sweat. They needed a plan B, a safety net. And the strategy they landed on had a simple name. China +1. The idea was simple. Keep some of your factories in China, but move a chunk of your production to a second country. Somewhere cheaper, somewhere friendlier, somewhere with room to grow. And when the world's companies pulled out the map to find that somewhere, one country was sitting right there, practically waving its hand. Young, cheap, stable, right on China's doorstep, and desperate to grow. Vietnam was the perfect landing spot for China +1. And so the floodgates burst open. First came the electronics giants. One of the world's largest phone makers began building enormous plants in Vietnam. Today, a massive share of that company's phones are assembled on Vietnamese soil. It became one of the single biggest investors in the entire country. Then the footwear and clothing brands stormed in. Hundreds of millions of sneakers are now stitched in Vietnam every year. A huge slice of the shoes on the world's feet begin their life here. The clothes hanging in your wardrobe increasingly start in Vietnamese textile mills. Then came the true tech titans. Wireless earbuds, tablets, and laptops began rolling off Vietnamese production lines. One of the biggest chip companies on Earth built a giant plant to package microchips. Vietnam was climbing, step by step, from simple shoes toward complex electronics. And the foreign money arrived not in millions, but in tens of billions. Empty rice paddies were paved over into humming industrial parks. The government created special economic zones to welcome them. Low taxes, easy rules, and cheap land pulled the investors in. And millions of Vietnamese did something their grandparents could never have dreamed of. They walked off the rice farm and into a factory job with a steady, reliable paycheck. For a poor rural family, that steady wage was life-changing. Villages swelled into towns. Towns swelled into cities. And a brand new middle class exploded into existence. Scooters flooded the streets. Shopping malls opened their doors. Coffee shops, smartphones, motorbikes, a whole modern life bloomed. In just one generation, a starving nation had become a rising one. It genuinely sounds like a perfect, flawless success story. But here is the catch, and it is a serious, dangerous one. Vietnam is not, for the most part, getting rich by inventing things. It is getting rich by assembling things that other people invented. And there is a world of difference between those two. Economists sometimes describe it with something called the smile curve. At one high end of the smile sits design and engineering, where the big money is. At the other high end sits branding and marketing, also hugely profitable. But down at the bottom of the smile sits low-paid assembly. And that low, cheap bottom is exactly where Vietnam mostly sits today. When a phone that says Made in Vietnam sells for many hundreds of dollars, Vietnam itself often earns only a handful of those dollars for the assembly, while the foreign company that designed and branded it keeps the enormous rest. Vietnam does the hard, sweaty, low-value work. Someone far away keeps the valuable, high-value ideas. And that arrangement creates a deep and dangerous dependency. Those foreign factories feel no loyalty to Vietnam. The moment another country becomes cheaper, they can simply pick up and leave. And there are already cheaper countries lining up for their turn. Economists have a chilling name for the danger Vietnam now faces. They call it the middle-income trap. It works like this. A poor country gets rich by being cheap. But as it succeeds, wages rise, and it stops being the cheapest option. Yet if it never learned to design its own valuable products, it gets stuck. Too expensive to be the cheap factory. Not skilled enough to be the clever designer. Trapped in the middle, its incredible growth suddenly stalls. Many promising countries have fallen into this exact trap and never climbed out. Vietnam is acutely aware of this danger, and so it is now locked in a race against time. A race to climb from cheap assembly up toward real design and innovation. Before it's young, cheap labor advantage quietly runs out. It is pouring money into training engineers, not just factory hands. It is pushing to build its own homegrown brands and technology companies. And it has a powerful role model to follow. Because one country did exactly this climb, and one spectacularly. South Korea, not so long ago, was also dirt poor. It too started by making cheap, simple goods for richer nations. But it invested relentlessly in education, technology, and its own brands. And it climbed all the way to the top of the smile curve. Today, South Korea makes some of the most advanced products on the planet. Vietnam desperately wants to become the next South Korea. Whether it can pull off that climb is the single biggest question of its future. And the road ahead is genuinely difficult. Vietnam still faces some serious challenges. Its electricity grid is straining to power all these new factories. Blackouts can still strike, frightening the very investors it needs. Its roads, railways, and ports need constant, expensive upgrading. Corruption and red tape can still slow business down. And there is a slow, quiet clock ticking in the background. Vietnam's own population is beginning, gradually, to age. The giant wave of young, cheap workers will not last forever. One day Vietnam may grow old before it manages to grow truly rich. That is the race. That is the stakes. But for right now, in this moment, the boom rolls powerfully on. And this is the point where the whole story reaches out and touches your life. That China plus one shift is the reason the little tag in your clothes keeps changing. It is why more of your gadgets, your shoes, your gear, now come from this one place. You are, quite literally, holding a physical piece of this boom in your hands. The next time you spot those 3 words, you will understand the entire story behind them. The story of how one desperate decision, made at the perfect place, at the perfect moment, can completely rewrite a nation's future in a single human lifetime. From starving, to sprinting. That is the story of Vietnam. Now, if you want to see the mirror image of this story, a country that had every advantage and threw it all away and collapsed, watch the video appearing on your screen right now. And if you love pulling apart how the world really works, one country at a time, then do one simple thing. Subscribe. A brand new country, fully explained, every single day.